into the room. There are a lot of people connecting. So whether it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night here, depending on which part of the world you're connecting from, we'd really like to welcome you to our INTALiNC Research Early Career Showcase. And we'll just give it a couple more minutes. Thank you for those that have joined on time. We seem to have calmed down a bit in the waiting room, I think. What's your feeling, Emma? Should we start?
You can get started, Karen, and I'll keep an eye on the waiting room.
Okay, thanks ever so much. That's great. So I'll just very quickly take a couple of minutes to introduce people to INTALiNC, which is the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities. For those of you who don't know us, we're a global network. We cover 5 continents, and the idea of the network is to transform research into practice in low-income communities, particularly in low-income neighbourhoods and for low-income and vulnerable population groups. So we concentrate on issues around gender and age, disability, ethnicity, but we also concentrate on issues around the peripherality of low-income communities and lack of connectivity to the mainstream activities of the city. We've been going for about 4 years, since early 2007, and we basically run a series of activities. We have a website, and we'll tell you all about that later. One of these activities at the moment is our Early Career Researchers Showcase, because this is we find that sometimes the early career researchers are doing fantastic work in and on the ground across the globe with low-income communities, but they perhaps don't have quite the same opportunities to present their work, especially in big conferences where perhaps the more experienced academics take the foreground and people feel a bit more nervous to present, perhaps. So this is going to be run on, you won't see my face until the end again now, because the moderators are themselves early career researchers, and that's my colleague Emma Sonover at Manchester University, who will do the second session of moderations, and our colleague from America, Alejandro Manga Tinoco, who will do the first half of it. Sorry, Alejandro, I'm very bad at pronouncing when I'm nervous. So I'm not going to take any more time up. We'll have 2 sessions, and the way that they'll run is that they each have a series of very short presentations. Each person has only 7 minutes each to present their work and their slides. We'll have quick, rapid turnaround, and then we'll have discussion after the first 6 presentations. And we try to group them together so that they sort of interact with each other. And then we'll have a quick comfort break so that people can just stand up and stretch their legs, because we know we're all getting Zoom fatigue, and blink so that we don't get square eyes. And then we'll have a second session and a second series of discussions. And the way that we'll handle the discussions is, because obviously the audience can't all be on the screen at the same time speaking, because we have about 60 more participants, which is fantastic, guys. Well done. We'll take questions in the chat function. So if you can put any questions as you're going in the chat function. If you want to say who they're for, that's fine. If they're more general questions, and we'll collect them up as we go along, and then we'll use the question and answer for you individually to respond to those questions. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Alejandro, who is going to take the first session. Thanks, Alejandro.
Hi, thank you all. So yeah, so I'm Alejandro Manga from PhD candidate at Drexel University and the Université Paris Gustave Eiffel in Paris. And it's my pleasure to be co-hosting this event. So I will start by introducing Tamara Kirschner, and I'm sorry if I like her and I get nervous and family names are difficult. So Tamara is from UC Berkeley, and she will be presenting on informal transportation, flexible informal transportation. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. Sharing. Okay, so I'm researching what's called informal transportation, also known as paratransit. I think for many people here, that will be sort of a familiar concept. So these are the kind of mid-sized, small vehicles that operate in a lot of global South cities. And they're often described as flexible, almost axiomatically. That's one of sort of the key descriptors. And the way this model usually works is because they're private sector, they're privately owned, and they're all sort of in free competition. They're very rarely amalgamated into like bigger firms or even cartels, and they don't have a lot of sort of top-down regulation and planning. So they're very good at developing these kind of flexible, adaptive route networks that really are well fitted to the city. So, for example, this is a map from, on the right, a map of all the routes in Lubumbashi, the informal transport routes in Lubumbashi, which is the second biggest city in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's about 2 million people. It's pretty large. And there's over 60 separate routes. So we can almost think of these as, I like to call them kind of metropolitan desire paths, where because the drivers of these vehicles have this very strong incentive to fill the bus, they're very good at finding kind of local niches of demand and local understanding the local needs of people and providing a system that has sort of good connectivity, right? And the flip side of this is, as we know, there's very poor labor rights in the sector. So these are very, very long working hours. They're often under these very exploitative contracts. There's no kind of like recourse to health or safety issues. And sometimes drivers might work a 15-hour day and walk away with almost nothing because they have to pay this like very high fee to the person who actually owns the vehicle. On the other hand, the argument is because there's so much competition, because there's so little regulation, at least there's sort of a good distributed, flexible, adaptive network. So the map on the left, your left, the map of the green blobs actually shows not just the distribution of the routes, but the volume of vehicles along each corridor. And those green blobs are just distance to the station. So the bigger ones are 1 kilometer. So actually, when we start sort of honing in a little bit, at least for this city, start to notice that there's really, really large areas that actually have no coverage at all. These are areas that have hundreds of thousands of residents, and nevertheless, they're miles and miles away from the nearest bus terminal. And then the width of the line and the color represents how many vehicles are actually operating, and those kind of red and orange lines represent just a few vehicles an hour, which is only a few thousand passengers per day. And this is a city of 2 million people, and these neighborhoods, again, contain hundreds of thousands. So basically, I'm asking sort of two questions in my research. One is, who is this network adaptive to? If we think of these as these metropolitan desire paths, is everybody able to kind of tread the grass equally heavily? Is everybody able, every neighborhood, every population, every different genders, different forms of employment, levels of income, is the system equally responsive, equally good at creating routes for everybody? And the second question is actually taking apart that mechanism of reactivity a little bit, this assumption that this kind of free market competition between individually operating vehicles is actually a good way to assess local demand and local needs. So this is based on empirical work now in 5 cities that don't have very much in common, except fortunately they're in the same time zone, so they're sort of easy to visualize on a map. And I've sort of divided them into 2. So Lilongwe, Djibouti, and Lubumbashi. Lilongwe is the capital of Malawi. Lubumbashi, which I've discussed, and Djibouti is kind of a city-state on the Horn of Africa, are very kind of this classical model. So they're very atomized, what we would say. There's no organization into firms, cartels, or route associations are very, very weak. The city government or the state really plays no role in spatial planning. If you want to operate as a bus in one of these cities, you buy a vehicle, you get a license, but that license covers the entire city. And within that, nobody will tell you, it's legal to drive here, it's illegal to drive there, or you belong to this route. You decide as the driver of this vehicle, where are you going to drive? Contrasting that are Nairobi and East Jerusalem, which are much more organized. So there, all the buses belong to a particular firm, or in East Africa, what's called a SACCO, a Savings and Credit Cooperative Organization, I think. And they're really regulated to specific locations. So they're only allowed to operate on given predetermined routes that are licensed by the government, and they have to belong to a bigger organization. So theoretically, this is supposed to kind of limit that reactivity and that flexibility, because this decision of where to operate no longer lies in the hands of the driver. The driver can no longer decide, you know what, I think there's like a pocket of demand over there. I'm in contact with people, and I've now realized that if I drive over there, I can pick up more passengers. And that's just not a decision they hold anymore, in contrast to these more highly itemized cities, right? But what I've actually been finding is the role of organization is actually what creates flexibility. So here I'm sort of pushing to turn the existing model, where the more competitive a system is, the more reactive it is, and the better suited it is for sort of the diversity of the population, a little bit on its head. These really constrained, destructive, I would say, labor practices actually mean that vehicles in these fully atomized systems behave extremely conservatively. You do not search out new routes on your own. You do not search out new pockets of passenger demand, because you have to make this daily payment. So drivers have a very strong preference to stick to safe, familiar routes. I've interviewed drivers now in these 5 cities, and in the cities where they're allowed, where they have the authority to decide where to drive, and I ask them, well, do you? And they just say, no, do not go out and seek new routes. They have complicated and quite sophisticated rubrics for which existing routes and which existing destinations are going to be the ones that will reliably generate the necessary passenger base. And they would prefer to wait for hours for the opportunity to drive on this one route that in some sense might be receiving too much service and is overcrowded and has difficulty filling all the vehicles, than they would driving off to like a new destination, or taking kind of a riskier route that doesn't involve the main destinations in the city, right? A classic suburb to CBD twice a day commute. So that's sort of the one piece of it, that we're seeing these like conservative and centralized route networks actually emerge because of these constraints in organization and in labor rights. The other thing to consider is you actually cannot operate a bus route with one bus, right? Somebody has to be the first person to say, you know what, we now recognize that there is a demand to go from this neighborhood, say, to that market. And that first person driving that route will actually gain nothing, right? Because you have to have multiple buses operating over a period of time to build up a passenger base. And so first of all, you need to be organized, you need to have a bunch of people working together. And second of all, you need to carry a loss for a while. And then even once you've managed to sort of establish that passenger base, immediately it will get swamped by other people, by other competitors in the system. So basically, this is my argument, that this idea of search behavior and of independent operators kind of organically identifying the demand of the city and responding to it is not great. I think that's a flawed and overly simplistic model. But in talking, particularly in Nairobi, where the government actually forced organization into these SACCOs about 10 to 12 years ago now, the model becomes much more interesting and much more complicated, and actually in some ways much more optimistic. So precisely these issues, these coordination failures where you can't start a route on your own, the SACCOs are tackling that. So the SACCOs, even though they're not understood as planning bodies, what in practice they do is transport planning. They will go out and they will measure demand, and they will estimate if there's a new location that would require a route. They're sometimes even approached by communities. So if there's like a new residential area, a new housing development, they will approach the SACCO that operates closest to them and say, can you start stopping near us now? And they'll do it if they feel there's a passenger base. They will advertise new routes, and they will subsidize the operation of their members until a passenger route is established. And they have sort of often quite good metrics for how long that's going to take. So I'm still in the process of interviewing these SACCOs. I'm in Nairobi at the moment, but the more I talk to them and the more individual organizations I talk to, the more interesting and sophisticated the system is becoming, and in some ways more formal. So these assumptions on like gut feeling and reactivity, they're actually, I think, a little romanticized. And in practice, what the SACCOs are doing is going out and measuring demand and collecting data in quite complex ways. But then they are also able, to a degree, to provide that sense of that reactivity to community needs, because they do initiate new routes and they do search out new passenger bases. That says, just to sort of summarize, the caveat is they're often more interested in competing with other SACCOs for the same passenger base than they are in actually finding kind of new nuances and new niches and serving very specific community needs. And here I think is where sorry, I don't know what happened there. So here is where more marginal populations or
Tamara, we need you to stop.
Yeah.
That's what's happening there.
Yeah.
all right,
Thank
I was
you.
looking for the blinking. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, great. Cheers.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Okay, so next we have Ritvika Rajiv from the Urban Catalyst, and she's going to be presenting on streets for mainstreaming women's access and mobilities in cities.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, everyone. So these street design guidelines that I'm about to present were actually part of a larger study on mainstreaming women's access and mobility in cities in Bihar. So a little bit of context about Bihar. So we're looking at small and medium-sized cities, and also a city where women's workforce participation is very low when compared to men's workforce participation. In fact, they make about 37% less trips than men, and most of these trips are actually either by walking or by shared intermediate public transport. In this study, actually, other than considering safer streets for women, we are also looking at land use as part of the street design process. So some of the main principles are safety and security, not in just terms of road safety and safety from crime, but also actual and cognitive sense of safety for women on streets, universal accessibility and mobility and proximity of care, which is about the street network design, as well as like the location of amenities such that it is convenient for household and care trips. We're looking at environmental sustainability in preserving trees and the natural elements of the street design process, the informal economy, especially street vendors, which are a big part of the economy in Bihar. We're looking at behavior change, which is basically providing guidance on advertisements, on signage, on information and communication to create a more gender positive environment, and also efficiency of space allocation so that we sort of prioritize movement of people over the movement of vehicles. So this street design, the template that we have are all the elements that we have considered for the street design process. I'm not going to go into detail here. So then when we look at the different types of land uses in Bihar, there are mainly 6 different types, which is city core, which is basically the old city, which is very dense and very narrow, which has got a very narrow street network and very high pedestrian footfall. So here we are looking at prioritizing non-motorized transit, having one-way streets and more of a neighborhood level of approach. We have the central business area. Again, mixed land use, demand for on-street parking is very high. So we are looking at providing space to street vendors. We're looking at managing on-street parking, providing public toilets, predominantly commercial areas, and we have predominantly residential areas, which is mostly like low and medium-rise dense settlements. And here we are looking at pedestrian priority streets, as well as child-friendly streets, traffic calming, speed reduction. And then we have peri-urban areas, and we have finally special neighborhoods. So this is where we have our organic settlements and informal settlements, as well as transit nodes. So in organic settlements, we are seeing very dense networks, very narrow streets. We are seeing very active street edges and no compound walls. And here what we're looking at is actually providing basic services. We're looking at traffic count streets, we're looking at upgrading the street services as a whole. And in terms of transit nodes, I'm talking about transit points where you have the bus stops close by, you have the railway station close by, and it's very complex and very congested. So here we look at multimodal integration plans and a very high quality public realm in addition to traffic and parking management plans. So this is actually the planned street design network. And so if we look at the block design, the existing block size in Bihar, we're seeing that is about, the perimeter is about 1.7 to 3 kilometer. And so we want to bring it down to about 400 to 600 meters. So then we are planning on having, breaking up these blocks with non-motorized transport streets. And these, what if I can call it, influence circles are basically the location of local amenities. And so we have one influence circle, which is about basically amenities that have to be accessed daily, which is about 5 minutes walking distance. And we have amenities that are that should be accessed periodically, which is about 10 minutes walking distance. And we have city level amenities that should be within 5 minutes of public transport. So these amenities were decided based on national guidelines. And then finally, I'm just going to go into a few, I'm just going to go into a few of the elements that we considered. So one was actually blind corners and dead spaces, because a lot of women are actually losing out on employment opportunities because they feel like streets are not really safe to traverse. So then some of the things that we have to consider in addition to this, let me just stop my video for a second. So then we have clear lines. So for example, landscape and high compound walls actually block the line of sight, and they make spaces, the perception of spaces very unsafe. So then here we think of having low compound walls or permeable compound walls, reducing the vertical clearance of landscape. Then in terms of visibility, in terms of blind corners, we can think about having street mirrors so that you can see what's coming up ahead. And also we recommend having off-street parking for goods vehicles, because in Bihar, mostly at night, they park on the road. So what this happens is that you have a high compound wall and you have your huge goods vehicle on one side, which creates a very narrow, unsafe space for women. And then in terms of street vending, as I mentioned, the informal economy is very important in Bihar. And if you look at this diagram, what we see is that one parking space can actually serve up to 3 people. But then if you convert that space for street vending, it can serve up to 20 to 30 people. So then what can we do to improve street vending? It's not just like assigning space for street vendors, rather we recommend having non-vending spaces. For example, areas which might block the movement of people, which are unsafe, for example, near junctions, right behind bus stops, cannot be designated as non-vending spaces, and all other spaces should be open for street vending. So then, including liminal spaces such as under flyovers, we recommend also having designated vending spots for women as well. And one of the things that we designed was also bus stops. So in this bus stop design, what I think, have I crossed the time limit? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. So next we have Aline Moreira Fernandez Barata from Oxford Brookes University, and her presentation is Rethinking Sustainable and Just Mobility from Below, an investigation of everyday mobility practices and spaces for participation in Brazil.
Share my screen. Can you see the presentation? Yeah. So hello, everyone. I'm a third-year PhD student at Oxford Brookes University, and I'm currently investigating everyday mobility practices and spaces for participation in Brazil. in order to understand how sustainable and just mobility is being promoted, shaped, reframed, and contested in a global South country. So significant shifts in mobility studies have been crucial for understanding mobility beyond physical movement and technocratic approaches, and also for incorporating inclusive approaches that celebrate participation as a vital condition for promoting sustainable and just mobility, for example. But little has been explored on the role and the complex interplay of participation and mobility. So this research emerges from two main research questions. The first aims to explore the role of participation in promoting sustainable and just mobility. And by asking this, I seek to identify the forms and practices of participation being incorporated and experienced on the ground, and to understand what the existence or the absence of spaces for participation mean to mobility theory, planning, and epistemic justice. So it's the simple idea that people should participate enough to promote structural changes to mobility and social inequalities. So the spaces for participation approach is one of the analytical framing adopted in this research, within which participation can be understood as opportunities, channels, where people can affect decisions, participating in decision making, and their own lives, so participating in city making. And they are differentiated by invited spaces where people are invited to participate, or claimed spaces where people claim changes with their own hands, with or without the state. And because of the wide range of meanings associated with mobility and participation, it also becomes important to investigate what participation and sustainable and just mobility mean to a constellation of social actors that are shaping, contesting, reframing, and suffering from mobility planning. So what do these meanings represent to mobility literature and planning? And to answer these questions, I'm conducting the research in Brazil, not only because I am Brazilian, I'm familiar with the culture and language there, but because the country has been through some political and mobility changes and has recently incorporated participation as a mandatory practice for the development of local mobility plans. And following Jensen's idea of mobility from above and mobility from below, the research explored national policies, local mobility plans, small-scale interventions, as well as transport projects and everyday mobility practices in low-income communities in two state capitals. So I'm focusing in Rio de Janeiro and Porto Alegre, cities that have different traditions of participation, mobility backgrounds, and informal practices. So far, I have conducted face-to-face interviews and online interviews with representatives of NGOs, city officials, academics, and residents of low-income communities, and I'm currently analyzing the collected data. So remote interviewing has also been beneficial to trace how the pandemic is affecting both participation and mobility in this context. And I selected one neighborhood in each city which represents low-income inner city areas that are not geographical peripheries, as you can see on the map, the dashed circle showing where the city centers are, but they are socially distanced from the immediate context around them and face extreme social and urban inequalities. So although Vila Tronco in Porto Alegre and Morro Santa Marta in Rio de Janeiro have been through slum upgrading projects or city-scale transport projects in recent years, the research findings indicate that these neighborhoods and residents' lived experience, knowledge, and mobility obstacles may represent blind spots in mobility planning. Through the online interviews and in photo sharing, as you can see, these photos have been provided by the participants themselves. The residents and the community leaders review their multiple mobility and immobility challenges that touch on secular social inequalities, power imbalances, intangible barriers, and incomplete citizenship. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't rush too much.
Thank you, Aline, for your presentation, and thank you for respecting the time. Now we have Tracy Matugi from the University of Cape Town presenting on the cost of job seeking in Cape Town.
Can you see my screen? Oh. Yes. Okay, thank you for having me. My name is Tracy Matugi. Like mentioned, I'm really delighted to be here to talk to you about my research. So when I started this research, I was interested in this idea of transport justice and how unequal access to transport affects livelihoods. So what I've tried to do with my research is to illustrate how this plays out in reality. And I highlighted the perspective of job seekers from low-income neighborhoods in Cape Town. So like any other good researcher, I started by reading the research that came before mine. And I'd like to paraphrase something from the very same Professor Karen Lucas with us here today. She notes that transport availability affects people's ability or inability to access the key life-enhancing opportunities, such as employment, among other things. And this really encouraged me to dig deeper into how transport access can essentially make or break a person's socioeconomic status. So in order to bring this point home to Cape Town, I had the opportunity to collaborate with a nonprofit called Organizing for Work, who have firsthand experience of the link between transport and livelihoods. So Organizing for Work is an organization that runs work readiness programs in low-income areas of Cape Town, and they help unemployed people find work. Their efforts have major importance in South Africa because unemployment is a huge issue nationally, and in Cape Town alone, the unemployment rate is at 29% at the end of last year. And from my engagement with Organizing for Work staff and members, I learned that travel is probably one of the most expensive parts of job seeking. So members shared with me that they made a variety of work-related trips, such as traveling to look for information about vacancies, traveling for training, traveling to certify documents, traveling for interviews, traveling to submit documents, and finally, traveling to go to work. And what I found was that 71% of the respondents from my sample actually had to cancel or postpone a work trip because they did not have enough money. And in addition, the most common trip that was canceled was actually for job interviews. So in order to make transport policy recommendations, which would support job seekers, I then had to look at how job seekers have been making use of public transport at the moment. And my initial assumption was that they would use the cheapest mode of transport available to save money. But I found that that was not the case in my sample. So for context, Cape Town has 4 main modes of public transport: the Metro Rail train, the Golden Arrow bus, the My City BRT bus, and the minibus taxi. And of those, the minibus taxi is usually the most expensive mode of transport because it does not have its fares subsidized by the government. So I was surprised to find that despite the cost of using the minibus taxi, 86% of my sample would use the minibus for their work-related trips. And when I asked why they use the minibus taxi, most of the respondents said that it was because of the proximity either to their home or to their destination. And when I compared the route coverage maps of the BRT service on the top left of my screen, compared to the minibus taxi coverage on the top right of my screen, it's clear that the minibus taxi does have better coverage in the low income areas of Cape Town. So I think this insight implies that the users of the minibus taxis don't really have the luxury to choose the mode that is most affordable for them, but rather that choice is made based on other things like what is the closest and the proximity of that transport mode. And they essentially would have to shoulder the costs that come with that. So in conclusion, my submission to transport policymakers would be to firstly target the provision of subsidized public transport in low income areas. And then secondly, consider job seekers as an eligible group for fair subsidization and fair concessions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tracy. Now we have Samwell Ajaji from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and he'll be talking about the environmental mapping and modeling of vehicular emissions and its public health impact on selected corridors in West African cities. So Samuel, if you could please share your screen.
I don't think he's here, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Okay,
he's
so
just joined, Emma.
I would, if it's okay. Okay, I think you managed.
Can we have it in
Thank you very much. Are you
presentation
hearing me?
view, Samuel, please?
Okay, thank you.
Can we have it in presentation view? Thank you.
All right. Environmental mapping and modeling of vehicular emission on public health impact on corridors in West African cities. Case study of Ghana and Lagos.
Samuel, I think you've frozen. Do you want to perhaps turn your camera off and just share the screen? Okay, that's obviously not working. So Alejandro, can you please, Samuel, can you stop screen sharing? We can't hear you, Samuel. Sorry, you don't have a good link. Can you please stop screen sharing and let's go to the next speaker, please, Samuel. Thank you. Thank you.
People and
No, Samuel,
people and
please, can you
information from one
stop
place to
screen
another is
sharing?
very of a nation. Also, with increased traffic emission has been.
Right. Sorry, but that's just not good enough for us to be able to hear it. Could we go to the next speaker, Alejandro, please?
Yes, Karen.
Thank you.
So the next speaker is Jessica Villena Sanchez from the University of Denver, and she'll be talking about the daily travel behaviors and transport mode choice of older adults in Mexico City.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hello, everybody. My name is Jessica, and I'm happy to present to you my research. You can see the title here. But basically, I care about where older adults travel on a regular day, for what purposes they choose to leave their homes, and what transportation modes they prefer to use when traveling. The reason why this research is important is because Mexico City is the fastest aging city in the country and one of the fastest in the whole region in Latin America. So it is crucial to learn more about how this growing sector of the population moves and identify current and future transportation needs. Now, let's start with a quick overview. Demographic projections tell us that by 2030, 2 out of every 10 residents in Mexico City will be age 60 or older. Now, I'm going to present some relevant socio-demographic characteristics according to my analysis. As a point of reference, all the graphs, tables, and results I introduce refer to an N equal to about 1 million older adults who reside in Mexico City. So just keep that in mind. This first graph shows the percentage of older adults by gender, age group, and employment status. Darker blue for employed older males, and darker pink for employed older females, and lighter shades correspond to unemployed older adults. The younger in age, the more likely older adults are to be employed. And it's relevant to notice that about 41%, or a little less than 500,000 people, older adults, reported to work. And a third of these employed older adults are older males. The second graph shows the education level of older adults in the city. It's very important to notice that if we sum the first 4 columns, starting from the top, we'd see that 73% of older adults acquired a certain level of basic education, but do not have an undergraduate degree or the equivalent of an undergraduate degree. This map shows the distribution of the different densities of older adults in Mexico City. Higher densities are shown in darker shades of orange and are located in the center of the city, which correspond to the oldest areas of Mexico City. Now, what about mobility patterns? The first graph shows the times of the day of all trips made by older adults by trip purpose. We see that most trips occur at noon and generally in the middle of the day. The most common trip purpose is shopping in green, followed by working in purple and socializing in orange. The next graph shows trip purposes by weekday. We see that purposes related to responsibilities such as picking up someone, running an errand, or going to the doctor are more likely to occur during the week, so bars in blue, whereas recreational activities occur more frequently during the weekends, bars in orange. Now, this next figure shows the percentage of trips made by older adults by transportation mode. Basically, about a third of the trips made by older adults were made by walking, which was a very interesting result. Another third, or a little less than another third, by car. And if we sum the public transit, buses, and taxi, we get about a 40% of remaining trips made by some form of public transit. Only 1.2% of older adults reported to bike. This last table shows how socioeconomic level of an older adult affects the amount of time they spend traveling or commuting. For example, poor older males spend on average 42 minutes commuting when they travel to a place within the same district where they live, and they spend more than 100 minutes or about 2 hours commuting when they travel outside of the district where they live. In comparison, wealthy older males only spend 20 minutes in intra-district trips and less than 50 in inner-district trips. Now, what about future needs? Based on my analysis, I also created a model. We don't have time for that to explain the model. All you need to know are some of the interesting results that I want to share regarding certain transportation modes. So when it comes to walking, older males are more likely to drive in comparison to walking, and they're more likely to own driver's license and to know how to drive, etc. When it comes to public transit, older males are less likely to prefer public transit over driving in comparison to older women. So we can infer that older women use public transit more than older males. When it comes to taxis, as older adults become older, they're more likely to prefer taking a taxi in comparison to driving. Maybe they don't feel as safe driving. Maybe they prefer to pay. It's more comfortable than using public transit. Buses, older males are less likely to prefer buses over driving in comparison to older women. And lastly, keeping all of these factors into consideration, we can conclude that older adults in Mexico City present different mobility patterns depending on their age, gender, which is a very important factor that I found shows important differences, residence, socioeconomic status, and employment status too. We need more investments in public transport infrastructures, and the city also needs to improve access for low socioeconomic older populations. I argue finally that city officials need to plan for more equitable, accessible, and affordable mobility solutions to achieve efficient transportation systems that serve everybody, especially vulnerable populations, such as older adults. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Jessica, for your presentation. So let's try to give Samuel a second shot. So I'm gonna ask him to share his screen again on presentation mode and to not turn his camera on to see if we can listen to him.
Thank you very much. Can you listen?
Thank you,
can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Opportunity. environmental mapping and modeling of vehicular emission on the public health impact on corridors in West African cities, Accra in Ghana, and Lagos, Nigeria. Now, if transportation is felt, the effective movement of people from and information from one place to another is very important as it affects the cultural, the political, the social life of people living in urban areas. In the recent years, the number of vehicles in Africa has been increased greatly, and traffic emission has been recognized as one of the primary sources of urban air pollution, which has caused so many premature deaths. 2017, find particularly matter what estimated to be linked to 2.9 million premature deaths globally in the world, and also that same year, 80,000 premature deaths in Africa, especially Lagos, Nigeria, and death from cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease. We have lung cancer, we have diabetes, we have asthma. Asthma is common with infants and children. Currently in Nigeria and Ghana and other developing cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have no little attention as we pay to traffic emission data collection and the health impact of it on the public around the corridor. So this research will be looking at the collection of data. Okay, I'm looking at the congestion. Congestion affects the intensity of this emission from vehicles. We also look at the road geometric features, the road width, and I also look at the traffic composition. The car fleet of most West African cities comprises of old and used vehicles imported from European and American countries, and which actually does not have this emission reduction policy. Also, we have the climatic factors, the environmental factors that affect this emission, and then we have the emission concentration, the emission levels of which pollutants, the CO, the carbon monoxide, the nitrogen oxide, the sulfur dioxide, and the particulate matters. Also, we have the public around the corridor doing their economic activities. So there are a lot of interviews and questionnaires being given to the public around the corridor to actually assess the knowledge of this traffic emission to their health and to assess the impact of which they have on their health. We have so many models to actually show relationship between these emission levels and the head-burden disease. Also by the land relation model, statistical model. These are an ongoing project, so that's why I'm talking this way. Also, we have information of these burden and these pollutants and recommend to reduce this traffic-related air pollution in West Africa. Also, for example, as a preliminary data on a freeway in Ikeja, Lagos, Nigeria, the freeway is 1.5 kilometers. And the volumes of vehicles occupying that place in congestion is 3,600 vehicles per hour during the rush hour, the 7 to 8 a.m., the 5 to 6 p.m. And then we have the queue length. And then we have this is the number of showing the number of vehicles composition on this route. We have more of cars, passenger cars on this route, and looking at the inventory we collected from the vehicle license agency, we understand that the cars are old. Some of them are imported 10, 15 years ago, and so they are old. And then we have the population around the corridor, the traders, the hawkers, the school children, the passengers, the drivers, the office staffs, and all the traffic officers and police and others. As the questionnaire was given to them, and out of the 500 interviews done for the public around the corridor are being selected, we have 270 response from the traders and the school children that complain of chest pain, frequent cough, difficulty in breathing, loss of appetite, headache, and they have record of hospital they have gone to the clinic close to them. We have some of the traders that have spent a lot of years around the corridor, have spent 10 years. We even try to ask the question, why, when you are aware about this effect of this emission, why not trying to leave this corridor? The response was the economic reason, that they have no place to go, where place to do the economic activities. So there's need to pay attention to reduction in traffic congestion, clean mode of the cycling network, and then shifting to more reduced vehicles, emission vehicles, than this diesel vehicle common in West Africa, because the diesel vehicle emits more particles than the gas engine technology. So there is need to sensitize and educate the public around the corridor of this earth hazard. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Samu, for your presentation. Okay, so we do have some time for Q&A. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm gonna be asking questions using both the questions that have been put on the chat box and the questions, some questions that I may have, myself, and perhaps if other moderators want to intervene. So the first question I would have would be for Tamara, and it comes from my perspective. So I'm a South American, and we do have informal transport systems in our part of the world. And a lot of the time in our part of the world, it's often the case that these transportation systems are linked to criminal organizations or mafias that control them. So I wonder if you found any links to this phenomena in the African cities that you have been studying?
Thanks for that. Sorry for rambling on before. To quickly respond, it's sort of a well-known phenomenon. It's, I think, not quite as strong as the literature I'm familiar with in Latin America. There's definitely historical associations, particularly in Kenya and maybe to a lesser degree in South Africa. But in many of the cities I work with, the kind of more secondary cities, actually the whole sector is often much less political and much less politically connected, and also much less subject to sort of scrutiny than it is in some of these like very well-known case studies, as well as in Latin America. So definitely an issue. I think maybe not as great.
So if you've been following thank you, Tamara. So my next question is going to be for Vika, and it's a follow-up question to so if you've been following the chat box, she answered the first question that she was asked, which was about whether they had the opportunity of having a pilot. Now, the follow-up question that I would have on that, and she says that they have not been able to do this with the decent cities, is what do you think, what are the, if you have considered the political considerations, or what would be required for you to be able to carry out such a project in one of, in Bihar, for instance?
So yes, I agree that, like getting the political will is one of the most important things that we have to look into. Also the funding. So right now, there is okay, I'll give you an example. Recently in the city of Bangalore, we have the construction laborers forum, and they had a lot of funding with them. At the same time, the transportation, the public transportation best, they were also facing a lot of losses as part of COVID-19. So what they did was that they actually provided subsidies for construction workers so that they could travel by bus. So it was like a win-win situation. The public transport corporation got the money, and they were able to use their fund for low-income groups. So we have to actually find and recognize opportunities like this, so that politicians will actually support them. Yeah.
Thank you, Ritika. The next question is, I'm just gonna use the question on the chat box, or the next question would be for Aline. Could you say more about participation and how it is used in a policy environment and how it is framed in your research?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. So basically, in my research, I've been talking about participation. The first step was to understand how participation was being incorporated to mobility studies. So I tried to, in the literature review, have a look of how and the different ways participation was coming along with mobility, and usually related to understanding people's needs and desires and people's knowledge and different ways in which these have come together. And looking at the context of my research, I'm looking at how participation is coming along in national policies, in local policies, and how also NGOs and academics are changing the agenda and also reframing how sustainable and just mobility are being framed. So I basically look at how the national guidelines moved from a dictatorship period to incorporating more inclusive approaches, and how this came across mobility and the whole movement from just transport related issues to more mobility and sustainable mobility in Brazil, and understanding how this came into local mobility plans, how the local authorities are facing the challenging of merging mobility policy making with participatory approaches, and also how these NGOs and academics are pushing forward more the different ways that sustainable and just mobility come across. And the last thing is, as I understand participation beyond institutional and state boundaries, I look at the low-income communities, and quite often they are understood as hard to reach people. And in the case when you look at the informal and the very bottom-up ways that they participate, maybe not only in decision-making, but in city-making, it became important to understand the ways in which they are participating. And it goes from self-construction, self-managing, and also protesting. And more and more, it becomes clear that they know what is missing there.
Thank you for that answer, Aline. I have a follow-up, but I will, if we have time, I'll ask it. If not, I'm just, we can talk about this later. So the next question, so once again, I'm going to rely on the chat box for Tracy, and it's about the role of walking and transport, and somebody will have, okay, it's explained there. What about RASA train lines that have not worked for a long time? So this is from a person working in Cape Town, so perhaps you can explain us a little bit of that.
Yeah, I responded to Claire in the message privately, but I can share what we discussed. So the PRASA train line is the Metro Rail train line that I discussed earlier, and it's one of the cheapest modes of transport because it's subsidized the most by the government. And I did have respondents in my sample who had actually said that they've missed a job opportunity because the train didn't come, because they're notoriously very unreliable due to the electricity challenges, due to the train carriages actually being set on fire by angry people, and stolen cables and so on. So it's one of the cheapest ways to move around the city, but it's also one of the more unreliable ways, whereas the taxi is always there. And regarding the role of walking, I'm not too sure. I haven't really looked into that closely. I was quite focused on the BRT system and the minibus taxi system and how they support people in low-income areas.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay, so next question for Jessica. And once again, I'm just using the questions on the chat just to allow for participation because of the time that we have, because I also have another question for you, but we'll see if we get to that later. So did you investigate potential travel difficulties and barriers that older people experience while traveling, and potential strategies they use to cope with such issues?
Yes, thank you. Different phase of my research was conducting interviews. So what I presented was basically the results from the origin destination survey. But when I did my interviews, I did talk to many older women, and they talked about the difficulties when they use the subway, when they use buses. They are specifically, and a lot of them had issues with bus drivers, not being as cautious, as patient with them. They also are concerned about just traveling by themselves. So some coping mechanisms that they use is that they travel during the day. They don't travel by themselves. They don't carry as much money when they go out. And yeah, but that's a very good question. And thank you, Radia, for your other questions. I do not know how many older women own a car, but I do know that 90% of poor older adults do not own a car. So mostly car ownership is basically just for the older males that are wealthier. Thank you for the suggestion of disaggregated by income, age, and gender. And I don't know if older women walk as much as younger women. I do know that older women walk certainly more than older males, but I haven't compared my sample with younger cohorts. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jessica. Now a question for Samwell. And my question is, you talk about the interviews that you're conducting with the people that live on these very polluted corridors. And I was wondering if you are planning on using some kind of GIS data to complement your survey, to use kind of a mixed method approach and see what you get out of that in terms of class, income, and other types of socioeconomic indicators.
Thank you. For the survey at the corridors, yes, we'll use GIS. I'm planning to use GIS for the spatial variability of these pollutants, but I'm not going to looking at the economic aspect of it, the cost. I'm not looking at the cost aspect of it, but I'm considering the GIS one of the very key aspects of the work to show it, and then also to look at the correlation between these pollutants and the burden of air disease affecting this public. Thank you.
Thanks. So this question, I think that the next question, and you will see who wants to answer it. So a big part of what I do in my research has to do with participation with community organizations and countercultural movements. And I work in North America, French-speaking Europe, and South America, and a lot of the time I'm thinking of my positionality, which is not the same having a privileged background in South America than when I do this in the United States or in French-speaking Europe, where I am not situated. So my question would be, it's a classic question for those of you working with participation, whether can the subaltern speak? And this is, I think this is relevant for Aline and for Jessica. And if you see, how have you started digging into these class questions that are so difficult to deal with in our continent, in the Americas? So whomever wants to answer.
Alejandro, would you mind repeating the last bits of your question? I think.
So for you, it's really because you're talking about the mobilities from below, so it's really clear. But participation, participation requires people to participate, and so the question: can the subaltern speak, or are they speaking to you in your cities, in the cities where you're doing your case studies?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And it's the thing that I think has been crucial in the research. And I think especially for understanding that inviting people to participate is not enough, and is not fair, and is not just in the sense that not everyone holds the same level of information and knowledge of planning. Doesn't mean that they don't have their knowledge and they're the best ones. They know what is missing, what is going on in their community. But when it comes to policy making and planning, there is missing information for both parts. So this is something that is being crucial, because that's how it's hard, because the NGOs, the academics, they have the direct link in the planning departments and the authorities. And low-income communities, they don't have this direct link, and they do stuff with their own hands, but there is something that divides them from doing something the neighborhood scale and not at the city scale. So there are difference of scale and the power imbalances of the reach that they can get to get things improved in terms of mobility. And so this is varying across all the cities. So it depends. So as I look at Rio and Porto Alegre, they have different backgrounds. Porto Alegre is well known for the participatory budgeting, and there's completely different approaches to participation in both cities. And while we have Rio, there's the high levels of informality. Participation is something seen that as something that they can do with their own hands. So I think it goes again to that thing that participation is not only within institutional boundaries, but is this enough to make changes in terms of reducing social inequalities and solving their mobility challenges?
Thank you. And yes, Jessica.
If we have time, I can give a quick response too. So participation in my research, it looked very different as I had planned it, you know, in the age of COVID. My plan was to go back to Mexico City, which is where I'm from, and have focus groups of older adults in different parts of the city. It was going to be beautiful. But of course, none of that could happen. So I couldn't fly home. There was no way I could gather groups of older adults, them being such a vulnerable group. So what I did is that I did phone interviews, and I made sure I chose areas of the city that were high income and low income, that had good access and to transport, to public transit, and poor access to public transit, to compare those results. And for me, it was an advantage to have family in Mexico. So I put all of them to work. They all became my research assistants in a way. And that's how I was able to gather participants. But yeah, I found their insight very interesting, because the origin destination survey gave me patterns, and they gave me their reasoning why, you know, why they choose to walk, why they don't drive. A lot of the women that I interviewed have never driven in their lives. They had no interest. So that was extremely interesting for me to see those gender and socioeconomic differences. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have another question for Tamara. I think we still have time for at least one last question. And so this question is about, once again, this question of perspective. And I had the impression, listening to your presentation, that the question, the way that is framed, like, is informal transport flexible? It's a question that comes from a perspective that comes from a person that comes from a privileged background from the North. And so I was thinking, if you were aware of people, either in the African context or other contexts, researchers based in these countries working from these issues, from their perspective and the positionality that one can have when working from one of these countries in the South?
So my advisor calls this title Insider Baseball, which I don't understand because I know nothing about baseball. But there's definitely a very long tradition in the literature on informal transport going back to the 1970s of using this phrase of flexibility and reactivity, and the assumption that kind of laissez-faire, all against all, invisible hand competition is effective. There is a parallel thread, I think, in the literature, which maybe has gotten less attention. Perhaps, I don't want to say, you know, this is coming from the South, that's coming from the North. I think it's a much more complex picture. But that does push back against that a little bit, and often criticizes romanticism, and is often, there's a fantastic body of studies by master's and PhD students going back sort of 20 years from across Africa, that does more empirical work, that is doing, you know, passenger interviews and surveys, and is often more skeptical, I would say, and more critical of sort of the efficacy of informal transport system. Whereas you could argue that the writing from the global North is at times a little bit romantic, or has a tendency to see this as a kind of insurgent bottom-up planning that we want to see, that we want to find, that we want to believe is powerful and effective and just in ways that top-down planning isn't. And I think that's, I mean, that's an oversimplification of the literature, right? It's not that anybody's saying these are great, top-down is terrible, everything's perfect the way it is. But I just think the complexity and the economics and the labor questions has been elided a little bit. I think what I'm trying to do with my work is say, it's not that this is bad or good, it's just complicated and powerful and interesting in ways that are overlooked sometimes.
Thank you, Tamara. Unfortunately, we have no more time for questions before the break. So we have a 20-minute break that goes until 3:30 p.m. UK time. So we're on a break.
Thanks, Alejandro. That's fantastic. Yeah, so if people want to log out and log back in, it will be the same login details. We'll be having some more discussions. I think we've had a great start there. Thanks so much to the first round of speakers, and to Samwell for persevering with his network difficulties. So far, so good. Fingers crossed. See you in 20 minutes. Thanks a lot.
Emma or Karen, I just want to make sure that I get access to the Twitter account for the next part. You're muted.
That's an Emma thing, not a Karen thing.
Okay.
I don't know how to give you access to it.
Yeah.
I have.
Have you got in?
I haven't. So I'm gonna try to log in now and
try and
be
log
sure
in
that,
now. I'm just gonna go and get a glass of juice. I'll be back in 2 seconds. Okay.
Okay.
That's great. Can I just ask, did anyone notice if Kwame's arrived or not?
I had an email from him to say he's coming.
It's coming.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So we'll assume for the speakers that are still in the room,
we're going ahead as planned.
We'll go ahead as planned.
I guess otherwise, if he doesn't get here till later, we'll knock him to the bottom of the list.
Yeah, and Jessica's not here right now, but she did a great job. That was fantastic. Okay. So I'll just put up a note that says we're on a break and a holding slide. Is that all right?
Yes.
I'll pause the recording. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the second part of our ECR Showcase event, which we have very loosely titled People and Experience. I'm Emma Sonova. I work with Karen at Interlink and have done so for, I think, 3 or 4 years now, more or less since the beginning. So without further ado, I think we'll crack on with the presentations. First of all, Sakshi Joshi from the Manipur Academy of Higher Education is going to talk to us about women commuters and their unequal access to mobility infrastructures in Delhi. Sakshi.
Okay. Is my screen visible?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sakshi, and thank you for joining. So my presentation is actually part of the larger Equima project, where we are looking at access to urban public transport in 4 South Asian cities. My own work focuses on women's travel experiences in Delhi. So this particular presentation is actually going to, I'm sorry, the slide froze for some reason. So in this presentation, I'm actually going to focus on what taking a bus might entail in Delhi, and to understand transport inequalities that get created because of your location in the city or because of your gender as a woman. There are a few key concepts that I borrowed from. Emma? Hi, Emma, is it possible for you to share the presentation? I don't know why it's like frozen.
No, that's, yeah, you have to unshare your own screen so that Emma can share.
Yes, I'm doing that. Yeah.
Thank you.
I did that. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why this happened.
That's okay.
I'll try to wrap this up quickly.
No, you're all right. We're all right for time. Okay, sorry everyone, we're just having a few technical difficulties here. There you go. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, thank you. So as I was saying, that the aim of this particular presentation is to understand what taking a bus might entail for women in Delhi, and to understand the transport inequalities that get created because of your gender as a woman or because of your location in the city. Some key concepts that I've borrowed from to understand how a city's growth might lead to unequal distribution of resources, or how your participation in the city might get limited. Methods that are used for data collection included in-depth interviews regarding women's travel routines, as well as observations on one of the key roads in the neighborhood where the fieldwork was being conducted. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this on your right is a map of Delhi, and on the southeastern border of Delhi, you might see a tiny being that looks like a tiny elephant, at least to me. So that's the area where the field work happened, and it's categorized as unauthorized, which means that access to provisions, including road and transport infrastructure, are negligible or rudimentary. So what this means is that already access to the city is kind of limited for the residents. There are limited transport options, the location of the transport modes, the cost of transport modes might be prohibitive. And then add to this mix the fact that your gender as a woman might create further inequalities. Now, when I say woman, I'm very cognizant of the fact that it's not a static homogeneous category. There's this range within that, and I hope that I can give a sneak peek into those different experiences. So imagine that I wake up at 5 in the morning, not simply to get dressed and walk out of the door, but because first I have to take care of all the in-house responsibilities, which can also include, if I'm a mother, to drop my children to their school and pick them back up. So while I am in the process of finishing these responsibilities, I'm also already strategizing for my plans for my travels ahead. So this can include situations such as, once I'm out of the door, what transport modes would be available? Am I going to find a traffic congestion on the street? Am I going to find that group of boys who are always leering, staring, singing? And if I do find them, what am I going to do? Am I going to silently walk away because, you know, they don't really change anyways? Am I going to respond? Am I not going to respond because I'm scared that it might reach my family and then they might not allow me to step out of the house, or they might ask me to change my travel plans? And once I manage to reach the main road, I might hope that I have not missed the bus, because, you know, bus schedules are kind of erratic, and I might roughly have an idea when the next bus is coming, but not really sure. And when the next one does come, I'm kind of hopeful that it's not overcrowded, because either I take the chance of getting into it and being touched or groped, or, you know, have my stuff stolen, or I end up missing the bus, which adds to my travel time. So just a few examples there based on what the participants discussed. Some key takeaways from this brief presentation. One, bus journeys are door-to-door mobilities. They are not just in-vehicle experiences. Two, the burden of manufacturing travel experiences rests solely on women, no matter how unsupportive or hostile their surrounding and infrastructure might be. Three, these travels have spillover effects on women's everyday routines. They contribute to not just long-term travel behaviors, but also how women live in the city and interact with it and navigate it. Thank you so much. And thank you for that technical thing that happened there.
So Emma, I think maybe you're muted, or?
There we go. That's our trick. Thank you very much. So the next presentation is from Kwame Odami. I don't know whether he's here or not.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. So Kwame Odami is from the University of Cape Coast, and he's going to talk to us about the alternative travel mode for commuters with disability in Accra, the lived experience of Uber and taxi drivers.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. My name is Kwame again, and this study forms part of a bigger project that looked at the responsiveness of public transport services in Accra and how persons with disability opt for an alternative option to escape the daily reality of the challenges associated with our public transport services. In fact, we cannot stress the importance of transport services in improving people's life. And for persons with disability, transport services become the avenue to reach various opportunities, schools, nightclubs, churches, and etc. But unfortunately for them, limitations in owning their own private cars, particularly for vulnerable populations like those with disability, implies that the most available option for them are the traditional public transport services, which manifest in the use of minivans, which we locally refer to as trotro services in Accra and Ghana in particular, and also the use of other services like taxi services, whether they are shared or chartered. But even with the use of these services, the literature also identifies that these public transport services are quite also unresponsive to the needs of these vulnerable population groups, particularly when you consider the physical conditions of the vans they sit in, as well as the entire transport infrastructure. Additionally, other issues that mitigate their ability to enjoy public transport services largely has to do with societal conceptualization about disability and how it influences transport agent attitude towards the disability community. And so it is in this regard that emerging public transport options, particularly in the capital city of Ghana, Accra, when you look at options like Uber, have played a critical role in bridging the gap in offering persons with disability an opportunity to also enjoy the kind of services other population group also gets to enjoy. And so for this particular study, because the objective of a study is to leverage on participants' lived experiences in looking for alternative travel options for traditional transport services, a qualitative approach was taken. And the Accra Metropolitan Assembly became the focal point, primarily because this metropolitan jurisdiction constitutes the national capital of Ghana, has the highest urban disability population throughout the entire country, and also have the highest vehicular population, both in terms of commercial transport users and private cars. And so, yes, I engage persons with disability, 50 of them, 28 being visually impaired and 22 of them being physically challenged, just to ensure the balance in representation between the two of them. You see, just as the preliminary findings identify the physical transport services as the key variable that militate against persons with disabilities travel options, the findings of the study, however, reveals that the key factor that drew participants or persons with disability towards emerging transport options like Uber services was actually not the physical conditions of these Uber buses, but rather has to do with the interpersonal relationship that actually exists between Uber operators and persons with disability in Accra. And this assertion was made clear when a participant reviewed the following narrative. And I want to quote. So he says, the Uber drivers are quite polite, professional, and since you have to rate them at the end of every trip, they have to be mindful of what they do. In fact, these assertions became a very common denominator in virtually all of participants' claim on why Uber services was deemed a most appropriate alternative transport option for them. And it is primarily linked to Uber's rating services, which also implied a behavioral control services for its operators. And since Uber had a way of terminating the appointment of drivers who record very low ratings for the services rendered, this was found by participants and also by the study to be one of the prominent features that sought to attract them because they are felt, they are given a friendly reception, they are made welcome, they are made to understand that their disability is not the reason for which they will be denied services. And the Uber services always became the best option for them. However, other key issue that attracted them to the use of Uber services was the convenience that came with ordering Ubers, particularly if you compare them to the traditional public transport services. And so if you look at the Accra city, for instance, mobile phone penetration is about 104%, which implies that every person has at least one mobile phone on him or her. And this made it easier because it prevented persons with disability from the hassle of walking out of their homes to a bus terminal, queuing, and even being denied the opportunity to enter a bus. And so with the mobile technology, it was easier for them to order their ride from their home and also enjoy the benefit of the last mile, which traditional trotro services or traditional public transport services in Accra would not offer them. But if you look at all of these, the list of them that actually came to their mind or attracted persons with disability to Uber service was just the conditions of these services. And I must say that most Uber services, most Uber rides in Accra, for instance, are privately used saloon cars, which are quite in pristine conditions compared to the traditional taxi services. But indeed, if you rate all of them, the fiscal conditions did not appear to be the most important to them when they are looking for an alternative transport option as compared to the demeanor of the operators. Finally, just as these people identified Uber, a key factor that was observed from the study was the fact that their preference for Uber services did not translate to high patronage, primarily because the use of distance time algorithm in calculating Uber's prices was also a disadvantage to them. And so it also made it difficult for them to plan their trip because at a point in time, the fare at the onset of the trip will not necessarily be the same as the fare at the end of the trip, and made it very difficult for them. So perhaps going forward, we would want to overhaul Ghana's public transport services to make it quite accommodating, both in terms of the fiscal services, both in terms of convenience and the interpersonal relationships, saying it is quite cheaper than these Uber services available to persons with disability. And so these were some of the key findings that sought to describe the attractiveness of Ubers to persons with disability in Accra, and also part of the study as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So our third presentation in the second session is called Looking Beyond Transport, Understanding Aging and Mobility, and it's by Prajwal Nagesh from the University of...
Great, how was it?
Hi everyone, I'm Prajwal Nagesh. So this paper is part of the larger ICMO project. In the next few minutes, I'll introduce you to our ongoing research on mobility of older adults in Bengaluru, India. So the question that we are trying to answer is to understand the kind of mobility barriers that the older adults face in the urban peripheries. Yeah. So by now we know that the most of the aging will take place in the dense cities of the global south, in countries like India. So particularly India is going to witness this demographic change with a larger proportion of older adults staying in the cities. So the catch is that the Indian cities are growing on the peripheries like Bengaluru, which are uncontrolled. In the case of Bengaluru, the peripheries have been expanded more than 10 times in the last 6 decades. You can see that in the map over here. So these peri-urban spaces are a constant site of transformation and conflict and have poor infrastructural services. So we're trying to understand how the older adults manage their needs, mobility needs and barriers within this spatial context. And we're also using the mobility paradigm to kind of understand the challenges beyond just human transport, also including the movement of information, goods and services. So in terms of methods, we are focused, we are trying to look at an integration of the spatial method and the ethnographic methods. We have the behavioral maps which were drawn. We could see it over here, which we have it for across different time period. And then we have the ethnographic. We try to use them together with geospatial to build a stronger evidence on the mobility barriers. So quickly moving on to the results. So the 3 key themes that I would like to talk about over here is the first one is the centralized urbanization that is taking place in the peripheries, as a result of which many of the civic services that the older adults would want to use have been centralized, that has moved to the core of the city. It could be, for example, a social welfare grievance cell where they could access their pension, to get a bus pass, to pay their taxes. Many of the government hospitals have been located in the center of the city, which is close to 10 to 12 miles. And the older adults who depend on public transport and which does not have proper frequencies, they suffer from this poor connectivity. And adjoiningly, what is happening is this, due to housing gentrification, could see a lot of vulnerable older families being moved to the periphery. For example, in Anjanapura, many of the Dalit slums have been moved to the periphery, as a result of which, when they're depending on the public transport, their access to these essential services become all the more difficult. You could see that from one of the quotes over here. And to add to this, looking at the infrastructure within the ward itself of Anjanapura, that due to an array of physiological changes from the literature, we could see that older adults suffer from degenerating eyesight, reducing muscular strength, and lowering energy levels, as a result of which they would like to prefer to travel slower. But what's happening in the peripheries is because of the lack of public transport, there's been a proliferation of private transport, which are traveling at greater speed and endangering the mobility of older adults. And also, from previous presentations, we could also say that the older adults usually would like to travel in the non-peak hours. And due to the lack of lighting, their travel after sunset becomes extremely challenging, as a result of which it's a narrow time frame that they're going to go with. And another part of the infrastructure is that they lack a major necessity is that they lack the stillness infrastructure. That is, due to the lower energy levels, they require shorter breaks to recuperate, recover. It could be like benches, it could be waiting infrastructure in the buses. So these stillness infrastructure is something that is kind of missing in these spaces, as a result of which hampering their older adults' mobility. And the third and most important result that came about was that most of the mobility interventions that were taking place in this peripheral ward for older adults have been more technological backed services, interventions. It could be the metro rail services, the app-based vehicle tracking. But when you're looking at the older adults' encounter with technology, it is often more challenging. Many of them feared, could see a quote over here, they feared getting onto the elevators. They were not aware of how to buy the metro tickets. They were not familiar with the infrastructure of the train stations. They also did not have the personal mobile phones to use these mobility apps. So on the contrary, what they demand is decent levels of traditional infrastructure, such as pedestrian facilities and public buses. So moving on quickly to the conclusion, to look at all these key findings. So what we can see is that there is a cascading effect of aging and spatiality, which is making older adults living in peripheries both immobile and isolated. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can you stop sharing your screen?
Next, we're going to look at a presentation by Sana Iqbal from the University of Coventry, which is called From Mansplaining to Manspreading, Understanding the Transport Poverty of Middle-Income Women in Karachi from a Feminist Perspective.
Thank you so much. I would just quickly start by giving so my presentation has stuck, it's frozen. Can you hear me, Emma?
Yes, I can. Do you want to unshare and share again, or I can share the presentation from my computer if that's easier?
Okay. Let me just try it one more time.
Oh.
No, it's not working. Sorry, it's not working. I think by the time you started, I would like to perhaps introduce the context of my research here. So my research was based in Karachi, which is considered the economic and the commercial hub of Pakistan. It is a densely populated city, so a city with almost 23 million population. Another key point regarding this city is that it has a very long history of urban and ethnic violence. So it's kind of very famous for its long episodes of urban violence. Yeah, thank you so much. So, and another fact around the perhaps very pertinent to our presentation today is that there's 0% representation of women in the transport sector. So there's no transport policy, there's no sort of, can you go back to the first slide, please? Yeah, this one, the context, yeah. Not just that there is no representation of women, but as you might see in some of these pictures, that the transport itself is sort of, heavily dominated by men. So let me give you just one example, that in our public buses, as you can see in the, in one of these pictures, women get only 7 seats while men get the rest of the seats. So women get like around 1/3 of the portion inside the bus. And then because of the social setup itself, women are not encouraged to ride motorbikes. So they can only sit side-saddle mostly. And another problem, which I kind of came across while doing this research, was the lack of data. So lack of data in the sense that there's lack of this, not just the data around vehicle ownership, but there's no gender breakdown or sex desegregated data. So I had to start my research with a quantitative survey just to understand the mobility patterns of people living in Karachi. So there are 18 towns in Karachi. So the survey actually was centered in understanding the mobility patterns of people across all these towns and across different socioeconomic backgrounds. So in here, I have sort of, quoted one of the research studies that was conducted by JICA, which is the Japan International Cooperation Agency. And what it shows here is that not only there is a lack of female representation, but there's a lack of female voice, which is also very clear, that even when they attempt to collect data, often the voice of women is not heard, or probably because of the social setup, it is not being heard. So what I got on with the task was that I wanted to understand the mobility poverty, the transport poverty experienced by women in Karachi, in particular, middle income women. And can you move to the next slide, please, Emma? So I started with, so basically I would probably emphasize more on the some of the less obvious characteristics here and some of the less obvious effect, because I think Sakshi has already touched upon a few of these. So can you press the next button? So it talks about, I have listed down here a lot of factors which might help you understand the layers of disadvantages that these women are facing, but I might be able to focus only on perhaps the issue of overcharging. So what happens is that although we all know that in many of the cities in the global south, women tend to depend more on paratransit vehicles, and this is the case for Karachi as well, because women cannot ride motorbikes and the number of seats for women assigned is very low. So women tend to depend more on rickshaws and chinchis. But these vehicles are not equipped with meters. So what happens is, because these operators know that women are at their mercy, they ask for more money from these women. And these women have to pay more because they don't have any other alternative. So as a result, they might have to, and they have to avoid some of the journeys, particularly non-work trips. And the multimodal trips or the transport itself is not designed in a way to support like a seamless multimodal or integrated journey, because each bus is individually owned, each rickshaw is individually owned. They don't really come under any, overarching system. So they end up spending a lot more than men. So then moving forward, there were very clear issues around design of the public transport. So if you would just click the next one. Sorry, there's animation here. So what happens is that transport is, even if there is a segregation, it is done in a way that disadvantages women more than benefiting them. So their argument, when I interviewed the key informants, like some of the policymakers, their argument is that they are trying that women are not sort of prone to harassment. But what happens is that the seats that are given to women are still, visible to men, and they are very close to the driver himself. So that also leads to a lot of intentional and unintentional touching, and women are sometimes actually facing men. So even if they, for example, and these buses, there's no ventilation, there is, of course, lack of space, and there is no storage spaces as well. So women if they are carrying their children or bags, they have to hold on to these on their laps. But what was interesting about this, and when I said less obvious, was that even if women try to, do like fanning movements just to, have some more air, that also draws men's attention. And that also has to be avoided because in a way they are actually putting themselves into more trouble. So they have to be really hyper vigilant that they do not do anything. For example, walk purposefully, avoid trips, all these coping mechanisms that they have to follow. And then thirdly, the issue around maybe, can you press them? Yeah. So behavioral issues, and I'm really sorry for the typo here. In here, I would really like to emphasize the element of purposeless trips. So we are not just talking about the gender-based norms here. So imagine yourself, like, for example, imagine yourself that you are highly educated and you are striving for upward social mobility, but they are not just gender norms, but they are class-based norms that are also operating. So within these families, there's these norms that take pride in women's immobility or forced immobility. So basically they take pride when these women are educated, but they are not, employed. And that this becomes a matter of, showing, who has more power. So this is when it becomes even more problematic for middle-income women, because for these women, a good woman is someone who is immobile or someone who is sort of complacent to all these gender and social norms. Okay, and then lastly, very quickly, the issue around macro level issues, which I have kind of tried to, put everything here, but it's mostly about the corruption that I want to emphasize. So when I interviewed the bus driver, he mentioned about this thing that they give weekly bribes to traffic police so that they can do whatever they want. They can run the service at their own whim, and they're not stopped throughout. But then it's almost like they don't follow any traffic rules. They can ask the passengers to get off at the middle of the road. So very quickly, I just want to conclude the slides here that one thing that emerged was that gender was a cross-cutting theme across all of these factors, which I tried to sort of emphasize. And women were disproportionately affected because of not just the gender-based, but also because of the social norms as well. And it is very important, of course, to address the gender gap, the gender data gap, because without that, it's very difficult to even understand the severity of the issue. And interestingly, just one last thing, if I can emphasize, was one of the key informant mentioned that women, when women face harassment, they don't really report it. So there was this disregard for women's, ability to even report harassment, although there was no mechanism to do that. So there is a need to sort of understand that how this zero tolerance policy for harassment is implemented. There's no surveillance. There's no one who is going to be responsible for it. And then, of course, we cannot assume that mobility is a universal right, because it's not equally distributed. And I'm really sorry if I exceeded the time, but that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last presentation in the second session is Maria Clara Trujillo Perez from University College London, who's going to talk about children's independent mobility, a child-oriented perspective on walking, playing and socializing.
Hi everyone. Today I want to share with you a bit of my research on children's independent mobility in a low-income community in Cali, Colombia. My motivation for this study was to challenge the adult-centered point of view of transport and urban planning, and to offer a child-oriented perspective on walking, playing, and socializing. So when we think about children and mobility, we often think about the growing research, mostly from the global north, which has focused on promoting active travel and physical activity. However, as this passage from Horton shows us, children's mobility transcends this emphasis and encompasses how they feel, perceive, and act in the world. So the study of independent mobility can help us bridge this gap and rethink the relationship between children and their neighborhoods in a more meaningful way, which is crucial in low-income contexts where children often walk as their only alternative to access opportunities. This study analyzed extensive children and caretaker surveys, which were facilitated by the NGO Despacio and their ongoing project Vivo Mi Calle. I analyzed these questionnaires through 5 themes of discussions, which I reinterpreted from the independent mobility focus. So Cali is the 3rd largest city in Colombia. The study area is located east of the city. And as we can see from the maps, it is densely populated and concentrates high levels of poverty and crime. Overall, the study found that 77% of children reportedly walked as their main mode of transport, which is higher than the 62 city average. And of those, 61% walked independently. There are 4 key findings that are compelling for research and practice. First, that actual independent mobility, children's perceived license and parental license were different from one another. In this context, independent mobility is not a fixed notion, but a constant negotiation between the child and the guardian to the changing household responsibilities and the social dynamics of the neighborhood. The second point is that while the built environment is inadequate, the social environment is the main barrier for independent mobility and play. So while children's main concern is road safety, it is parents' personal fear of personal safety relating to drugs and violence, which decreases independent mobility the most. The third point is that social safety mostly affects independent travel to quote-unquote non-essential social activities and the use of the street as a meeting place. So unlike many global north cities, while children have a high levels of independence for essential journeys such as going to school, their freedom to roam, play, and socialize is highly restricted. And the fourth and final point is that when play and social activities are allowed, the built environment does little to promote interactions. But I found that nevertheless, children have discovered ways to overcome these circumstances and appropriate the street whenever possible. So some recommendations that emerge from this study is that first, we need to rethink the meaning of mobility for children and the youth and consider their unique times, rhythms, and interests. Especially in the global south, we have to go from a focus on physical activity to one on well-being, because as we saw, there's high levels of walking, but low levels of free play. This study also offered a child-oriented framework that recognizes the complexity of children's realities in low-income contexts and can provide a path for future approaches. We must place their voices at the heart of projects and research, and encourage independence and play through multi-level actions aimed at the family, the community, and the neighborhood. And lastly, promote the street as a meeting place, creating safe and entertaining walking routes, because the trip is half the fun for them. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're a bit behind time now, I'm afraid, so I'm just going to whiz through some questions, mostly from the chat, quite quickly. But the first thing that I wonder, and it's a question for Sakshi, though I think it probably applies to most of the presenters this afternoon. It was referred to earlier about a different presentation. I'd like to ask really about the kind of difficulties of getting in touch with hard to reach groups for conducting this kind of research. I think you mentioned, didn't you, that these people aren't homogenous groups, so it's kind of how you go about reaching the less powerful players in those groups.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely thanks for the question. And yes, we did go through an NGO which has been working in the neighborhood since the last 4 or 5 years. So I think it was also especially difficult because of the kind of political climate that Delhi had at that time. I'm talking early 2020, last year, the fieldwork was cut short because of the pandemic, but we also had riots, ethnic riots towards the end of February. So, you know, just having somebody with me who people in the neighborhood knew kind of changed interactions because generally people were a lot more hesitant. People were, you know, like, of course, if you're asking them questions, then they would also have questions for you. So going through people who were already known in the neighborhood was how we approached it. Yeah.
Thank you. Another one from the chat box for Kwame about the different forms of public transport. I think somebody asked whether a rating system would promote the use of other forms of public transport for disabled travellers.
Okay, so I think having a rating system will be necessary but not sufficient to promote a positive image of persons with disability. And so I would suggest we have an entire educational drive to change the narrative and connotation of disability within the Ghanaian context, so that if people understand that having a disability is not a testament of curses or whatever, we will then be able to use the rating systems for GPRTU as a behavioral control measure, because now they have tend to appreciate persons with disability as part of human diversity. And so if we go beyond, if we pass the educational level and move straight into technology in rating the services, then I think we have missed the mark. So perhaps we would want to champion an educational drive first, and then ensure the establishment of an operational guidelines that will formalize public transport services within the Ghanaian context, and not leave it into the informal settings where it will be very difficult to regulate some of these things. So I think the rating system for other services will be good, but we need other services before we do that. Let's change attitude, let's inform people, let's give them the standard, and then give them options to comply and then detect what they are doing later. So yeah, maybe we should do other things before that.
Thank you. And I had a question for Sana in Karachi. I was kind of interested to know about the role of civil society and how they work with these women, what's being done to promote women's rights in civil society.
Yeah, so there are a lot of, for example, non-profit organizations and think tanks, such as Karachi Urban Lab is one of them that I can name off. There's Urban Resource Center, where they have also conducted a lot of research around the mobility barriers faced by lower income women in Karachi in particular, especially those women who work as domestic labor in many parts of the city, and the challenges that they face on everyday basis. However, somehow that has not really attracted enough attention in order to sort of, you know, build some sort of action or advocacy as such. But of course, there are many other groups as well. There are certain universities that are also working along the same sort of lines and trying to emphasize the disadvantages that women are facing in Karachi.
Thank you. And I think last, because we're more or less out of time, but Maria, there are a few questions for you in the chat box about the different the gender bias in the restrictions to children's play. Thought it was quite interesting. I think you're on mute.
So as I said,
can't hear you.
Mute.
Hello?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So first I researched 5 themes. First was license, then walking perceptions, experiences, and the neighborhood. So in terms of license, actually there wasn't huge significant differences between genders, between girls and boys, for the exception of walking by themselves after dark, after 6 p.m. That did change for girls. They were more restricted to go out after dark. And for their experiences and perceptions, they are fearful of road safety. And for girls, also street harassment. They talked a lot about men who harass them when they are wearing their school uniform, etc. But in this neighborhood, while I was doing the research, 4 boys were murdered. So that's what I mean, that it's a constant negotiation with the social environment, and it doesn't affect either boys and girls. It's just a fear that mothers and caretakers have for the safety of children.
Okay, I'll hand over to Karen now because we're a little bit over time, but thank you very, very much, everybody.
Apologies, you can now, can't you? Sorry, you can see my screen? Yeah, cool. Okay, so I think I'll just quickly let you do the notices first, because in case we run out of time before I manage to do that, I think just to draw your awareness to the fact that we now have a new website up and running. It's slightly different to the old one. We previously were hosted on the University of Leeds system, and since Emma and I have moved to Manchester, we decided it would be a good idea to be on the Manchester system. We thank you for this fantastic event, and hopefully we can be sort of doing more activities like this, which support particularly early career research and networking activities. So we're going to send a quick survey out to everyone to sort of think about what our future options might be for doing that. We're also about to announce an early career researcher photo competition in May, which will have some real life prizes. So that will be great, partly sponsored by the Volvo Research Foundation and partly by Interlink collaboratively. We regularly have meet and greet events about once every 3 months, roughly. We had one back in February, and we will have another one in mid-May, and anybody is welcome to join that. And we tend to just it's more about introducing ourselves to each other than these more structured seminars, just for new people that sort of want to join the network, and also for people who just want to keep in touch with each other. I know that Zoom isn't always the best way, but sometimes it's the only way. We last summer had a really, really good webinar series with some fantastic guest speakers from quite prominent places, from the World Bank and the African Development Bank, but also from really key researchers like Gina Porter. Heather Allen, I notice, is on the line here, so she was participative in that. So it's an opportunity for us oldies to interact with you youngies and to sort of like think about some of the issues that are coming up and emerging research ideas. And then finally, just very quickly, I am one of the editors of an urban book series, which is currently open for titles, particularly around transport and sustainability. So if any of you are at the stage where you're beginning to think about doing publishing your work, publishing your research, and you want to do that in a format that is more of a book, which gives you more of a chance to expand your ideas, particularly maybe if it's a PhD and you want to publish a PhD. Obviously, you can't do it exactly the same as your PhD publication, but you have to do some work on sort of telling the story a bit more, but we can help you with that. So anybody who's thinking about that, even if it's not for the next year, but would like to do that, or is working for an organization where you think you might like to do that, that's great. And one of the great things about this Springer book series is that they will do printed, e-printed copies, but they're actually printed for $24, which is amazing. So it means that they're affordable to people, to partly to have on your desk if you want, but also to universities that don't have so much money to pay for really expensive library copies. So just get in touch with me if that is the case. Other than that, I mean, would like to say thank you. This is the second Interlink event that we've had specifically targeted at early career researchers, the first being a physical event that we had in Oxford back in 2009. And thank you so much to all the speakers for managing with this horrible virtual environment. I'm sorry for the people whose technology didn't necessarily come up to scratch, and I know that it was none of your faults, but I think we managed okay, and hopefully nobody was too frustrated listening to us, so thanks for that. I just think we've had some great new insights from you in terms of thinking about not only what happens with transport and mobilities and accessibility for low-income communities, but how that has an intersectionality with issues such as gender, age, disability, and social inequalities, and vice versa, how those inequalities impact on transport, mobilities, and accessibility. I would really encourage you to think about these things in terms of the consequences for the social development goals. I think this is a real way to engage policymakers, not only in transport, but also outside of that, to really think about the consequences of poor transport and poor transport systems in terms of other outcomes such as health and education, social well-being, livelihoods, employment, many of the things are the issues that you've already brought about. I think that we can really tell a strong story around those sustainable development goals and how they're undermined by transport inequalities, mobility inequalities, and accessibility inequalities. And also I was picking up on the idea of the sort of idea about minimum standards, Kwame, and having some minimum standards across a number of different criteria for what the environment should be like, not only transport, but the public realm. And thinking about the sort of way in which we should be auditing our cities to be child inclusive, age inclusive, gender inclusive, disabilities inclusive, and space inclusive. How you end up with an elephant stuck on the edge of a city that you can't get to, you know, that it's just there and it's already disadvantaged, and then it doesn't, and then it doesn't also have access to the city in terms of transportation. Those sort of things need to be brought into question. And the whole idea that, yes, cities will be increasingly informal, but we can't just leave them to be informal, and that we need to sort of think about how we effectively retrofit and sort out these inequalities. So I think that's it from me. Thank you ever so much to Alejandro and Emma, because they organized all of this. They put the whole thing together while I was on my Easter holidays, and they've managed to host it admirably. So I'm glad that the next generation is taking over, and that I know that it won't end, you know, that all of you guys are really propagating this research, and it's absolutely fantastic to see all of your wonderful new efforts. So thanks so much for that. I don't know whether there's anything else, Emma, that you wanted to do in terms of housekeeping. Okay, so thanks to you all. Thanks for listening. And we'll see you all soon. Don't forget, oh, that's the last thing. Don't forget to join Interlink if you haven't already. This is the website. Emma's online to be able to email if you want any questions. We'll put the presentations, we always do. Even the last seminar series is up there. So there's all the materials, all the slides and the recordings. They're a great resource for teaching and for all sorts of other things. Yeah, so hopefully.
It'll be on YouTube as well.
Yeah, and they'll also be on YouTube channel. Yeah. Great. So yeah, keep in touch, send us your stories. We also put newsletters out. So if you ever want to do a little news piece, we can also do that. I'm finding somebody wanting to be admitted to the waiting room. I think they've missed the boat. So thanks to all of you. Goodbye and do take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.